Talk more about AI and its implications, Dr. Sasha Luccioni joins me now on set. She's a leading scientist in AI ethics and sustainability with a decade of research and industry expertise. She's also the climate lead at Hugging Face, a global startup in open source artificial intelligence. Sasha, it's such a pleasure to have you with us on the program
Pleasure's
today.
mine.
First of all, could you explain a bit your research, introduce us to the research that you do and the work you do?
So my research really focuses on understanding the environmental impacts of artificial intelligence. So the energy that it uses, the carbon emissions that it emits, the water usage, because currently with the boom of artificial intelligence around the world, we're seeing that the planetary impacts are real and are growing, and we need to know more about them.
Now, a big part of your research is sustainability practices in AI, and as a part of your work, you evaluate the carbon emissions of AI models. This is not necessarily what we think of first when we think of artificial intelligence, which we just think something online.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's not material when we talk with a chatbot or with a voice assistant. We don't really see where it's running, but it's running on a data center somewhere using energy that was sometimes generated with coal, just sometimes with natural gas. So that really generates carbon emissions. And these data centers are getting bigger and bigger. The AI models themselves are getting bigger and bigger, and they're used in more and more applications, right? From navigation to chatbots to web search engines. And so all of this is growing in a way that's so far away from where we are that we have trouble actually even understanding how big it is.
Now, there was an opinion piece in the French newspaper Le Monde by a group of NGOs. It was titled, AI is accelerating ecological disaster, reinforcing injustice and worsening power concentration. They raised the question of, whether AI can truly serve the general interest when they're driven by governments and tech giants, essentially. In your opinion, how do we even begin to address these issues, these concerns?
I think the start of everything is transparency. Currently, we're operating with a lack of information, a lack of understanding of impacts, a lack of understanding of data, where it's coming from. So I think that in order to empower users and NGOs and nonprofits, we really need to improve the transparency, and legislation is going to be a key part of that. And actually, that's why the AI Action Summit is so impactful, because it brings together groups of people that normally don't cross paths, right? Like tech CEOs, government leaders, researchers, and nonprofit and citizen groups. And so bringing everyone in the same room and getting us to talk is really the first step.
Now, we have to talk about ethics because it's the one thing that keeps coming up every time we talk about artificial intelligence, and rightly so. There are the privacy concerns, but there's also, the question of inequality stemming from lack of accessibility to AI. In your opinion, what are the biggest ethics concerns in the face of, rising AI?
So actually, we recently wrote a paper with a researcher from INRIA and Meredith Whitaker, who's the president of the Signal Foundation, and it's about topics around ethics, sustainability, and profit. And actually, they're all really linked, because currently we see bigger and bigger models trained on more and more data that's our data, really data that's gathered from the internet. So there's the surveillance capitalism part of things, and with bigger and bigger environmental impacts. And so I think that it's all really linked because, for example, a huge model is hard to understand, and it also can discriminate in ways that we don't understand because we can't study it. And so there's like all these questions of who owns the models, whose data it is, who's represented in that data, and also in terms of costs, the more expensive the model, the less people can afford to use it, right? And so smaller models can be owned by people from the global south, academia, whereas bigger models tend to be created and deployed by big tech companies. So really, for me, focusing on bias, ethics, and kind of frugality or efficiency, they're all really linked.
And as you very well may know already, there's the data center deal that's been struck between France and the UAE. It's obviously a huge project with billions and billions of euros invested. In economic terms, it may be an advantage, but from an environmental point of view, it's going to just majorly pollute.
So if the data centers are in France, actually the energy here is at least low carbon. It's not renewable quite, but it's low carbon. So there's that. But I think that, currently there's this emphasis on sovereign compute, on owning data centers in countries. And I think that often goes against sustainability principles. So it's true that I think that if we keep building these big data centers, it may just make things worse. But if we think about alternative ways of, for example, distributing compute or making it more efficient, more kind of democratized as well, then we can. But of course, that doesn't come with the same, pizzazz as announcing, a multi-billion-dollar deal. But saying, oh, hey, we took some empty warehouses in urban areas that were disused, and we're building some smaller data centers and recycling the heat so that it heats people's homes is a lot like more frugal. And sustainable as a solution, but of course, it's not as sexy, maybe.
It's not as sexy, but it's important, though.
Right, exactly.
Now, I think we need to talk about how AI can be a force of good, because we don't want it to sound too dystopian, and we can't dismiss the advantages that AI could bring. It can be, deployed to perhaps tackle climate change, disaster relief, even wildlife conservation. Can you give us more examples of what these might look like?
Definitely. I'm actually part of a volunteer organization called Climate Change AI. And for 5 years now, we've been bringing together people, funding grants, funding projects, organizing workshops. And essentially, there are so many ways in which AI can be a force for climate action. Everything from designing new batteries. So, for example, coming up with new combinations of molecules that are better than the lithium-ion batteries that we currently use. Biodiversity monitoring. So, for example, in Canada, I work with a team of entomologists to monitor moths in areas where there's no data. And so we have these AI-enabled cameras that detect actually new species that we never even knew existed, and we can track them. And then, of course, everything with remote sensing. So satellite dishes, you can even monitor the health of coral reefs from space using AI and LiDAR imagery and satellite imagery together. You can actually, without having to dive and go check, you can actually see how coral reefs are doing. So there's all this good out there, and it's not all bad, but I think it's important to understand that AI is not a single technology. There's so many different approaches, and what we hear about ChatGPT and all these, DeepSeek models, they're not necessarily the ones that are climate positive. And those climate positive models are usually smaller, very task specific, but we don't really hear about them as much.
Lastly, if you will, what responsibilities are or should be at the forefront of governments and businesses who increasingly need to create AI systems which are ethical, transparent, and sustainable? I mean, what do they need to be doing differently that they're not doing now?
I think we should be asking for more accountability from tech companies, because especially if governments are adopting these tools as part of their, internal or external processes, we need to make sure that, for example, we know how much energy they're using. We know what data they were trained on. We know how the data that we put into these models is being used, right? Is it a privacy violation? And I think currently we're often governments and people, citizens alike, are taking it as granted. Oh, we're going to use this tool because it's supposedly the best one, right? Because some tech company said that it has the best accuracy, but we should be really questioning this discourse more and asking enough questions so we can make informed decisions without just believing that it's the best and greatest.
Indeed, very, very important indeed. Dr. Sasha Luccioni, thank you so much for being with us on the program today. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.